We have Decluttering royalty on the show today. If you've ever watched the TV program The Hoarder Next Door, I'm sure you will remember psychologist and presenter Stelios Kiosses.
You're listening to the Declutter Hub podcast, bringing you tried and tested, no-nonsense tips and advice from the leading experts in decluttering and organising your home. Now here's your host, Ingrid Jansen.
Hello and welcome listeners to episode 160 of the Declutter Hub podcast. I'm Ingrid. In today's episode, I'm talking to Stelios Kiosses, a psychotherapist and clinical lead for Edison Education. He studied at Oxford University, teaches at Harvard University, and is also known here in the UK as TV psychologist and presenter for Channel 4 series The Hoarder Next Door. And that is how Lesley and I first heard of Stelios, because we saw him on the TV talking to people who suffer with hoarding disorder. So welcome, Stelios.
Thank you so much for having me at your show. It's a great honor, Ingrid, and I've been waiting for this for some time now with great excitement and anticipation.
Thank you so much. Well, same here. We are super excited to have you on the show. And Lesley and I met you at a professional organizers conference several years ago. And when we saw that you have a new book out, The Power of Talking, we just immediately reached out and thought we need to have you as a guest on the podcast.
Well, thank you so much. And it's a great honor. You've read my book. And yeah, I mean, this book has been a great challenge, but a great reward at the same time.
Okay. Now, your book is a series of stories from your therapy room. And I must admit, I loved reading all of the stories. And I'm sometimes thinking, how are these people now? I want to know what happens after.
Well, it's difficult to know because some of them are many years ago. Again, they're composite stories. So there's an element, obviously, that is true in those stories, but there are composite stories. And these people do exist in some shape or form. But it's difficult to know because a lot of clients you might have seen 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. Some do keep in touch. And I think a lot of them kept in touch after watching my series on television. And they were able to get in touch and perhaps just say how they were. And all of them have been, from the ones who've got in touch, been really good and they've been progressing and quite healthy, I may say.
Oh, that sounds amazing. Because yes, we're definitely going to talk a little bit more about the TV program and about hoarding in the second part of this podcast. But I was reading your book and so many of the stories and the things you describe, I can really feel they're related to people with clutter. So, for example, in Garrett's story, you talk about synchronicity. And it really reminded me of the stars aligning. Things sometimes are meant to be. It's just not a coincidence that sometimes things happen for a reason, right?
That's correct. And it's something we all experience. It's not just experienced in a therapy room, but I think as therapists, we tend to come across this quite a lot where, obviously in our personal life, you think of a song and then suddenly that song is playing on the radio,
Yeah.
How does that happen, or you think of someone and then suddenly they send you a text. It happens to all of us. And sometimes, we don't pay attention. There's different theories about it. And I do explain in my book, there's some scientific evidence, but we're not there yet. And I thought it was important to include it in one of the case studies because we do come across with our clients these types of synchronicities or similarities or sudden a coincidence that happen in our lives. But if I may, I just wanted to explain the title of the book, which I think is really important and ties in consciously and unconsciously with every case study. So the title of the book is obviously The Power of Talking. Now, the power of talking reveals the power of listening, and the power of listening reveals the power of helping people change. And that's the whole book. The whole book is about the power of helping someone to change. And in every case study, this power of change has to do from being repressive to expressive, from repression to expression. So in every case study, or all the clients that we see come with some form of repressed feelings or emotions. And our task, predominantly as therapists, is to change that repression to expression, which is the power of talking.
I love it that you say that, because I'm actually, it's very funny because I actually love to talk. But I think being a professional organizer, I've also learned to listen.
Yeah, exactly.
And that is not easy for somebody who loves to talk and is quite
Exactly.
expressive.
And that's why I think, the power of talking also, for those who have picked it up, it isn't just talking with your mouth. We have body talk.
Yeah.
We use the word talking in other forms of unconscious ways of communicating. So when I say the power of talking, although most people will relate obviously to the power of talking verbally, there is also talking in silence. Mm-hmm. There's talking in mindfulness. There's talking with our body. There's talking with our unspoken messages. So talking isn't just talking with our mouth, and you will see those type of different expressions of talking in the case studies. We use silence for some clients to express themselves and talk. Mm-hmm. We use imagery. We use different exercises, whether it's from psychodynamic therapy or CBT. All of these are different forms of talking or expressing. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm going to actually ask you another question, because I think that fits in really well what you just said, because in John and Alice's story, you wrote about something that's very close to my heart, and that is intuition and gut feeling. And that is something that has guided me really well over the years, and I've learned to trust it. And I've not berated myself when I didn't listen, and it didn't work out. But I just went, I'm not going to berate myself. I knew I should have listened to my gut feeling. Okay, how am I going to do this different next time? So is gut feeling something a lot of people don't trust?
Yes, and I think the best really quote for this is when you read Sherlock Holmes, and Sherlock Holmes says to Watson, Watson, we both see the same things, but I see the details. And in a way, that's what intuition is. It isn't something magical. It isn't something, extraordinary. It is an unconscious way of picking up the subtleties and interpreting those in an unconscious way, and understanding if what we are experiencing or what we're sensing will perhaps put us into danger, or there is some kind of caution. And each one of us has a variety of strengths and weaknesses in terms of how we use intuition. So intuition isn't anything magical. It is something that we have, that we are born with, and it is something that we can develop and make it more effective through listening to our bodies, our minds, and the world around us. And I think we have to trust our intuition, because it's our basic animal, primal way of survival. We used to have that instinct even more in tune with us when we used to live in caves, and 60,000 years ago plus. We have that intuition for a survival mechanism. And sometimes, and the interesting fact, that can go with negative thinking, and a lot of people think, well, I want to eliminate negative thinking, and negative thinking is also part of these case studies, and I do explain that negative thinking, you can't really eliminate negative thinking, and I explain why. Because negative thinking is an evolutionary aspect that we have developed. We have developed this kind of foreseeing danger. We'll live in a cave, and if there is any danger when I go out of my cave, how am I going to protect myself? So this kind of preoccupation with negativity is also part of who we are, just in case something bad happens to us. Of course, what is happening now is that we don't need to be that negative anymore, and there's other unconscious influences that don't validate this type of negativity. So part of therapy is also controlling and containing those negative thoughts.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And in later in the book, you said to get better, you have to ride the wave that comes home. Preparation and understanding are really important, but there is life, light, and hope on what is likely to be a long road to healing. And it just resonated with me so much, because Lesley and I really see that people who want to declutter and organize their homes, they go on a journey. It's not a project, it's a process. It's a road you need to go on, a journey you need to go on with in the day. And preparation is key. So we talk a lot about getting ready to declutter and not just open the cupboard and pull everything out, but you need to get yourself mentally, emotionally, physically ready to do this.
That's right. And you have to prepare yourself on all levels, and
Yeah.
emotional, physical, and spiritual for some people. Again,
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be religious, but in terms of your energy and your spirituality.
Mhm.
And I guess, clutter is an extension sometimes of who we are and what our internal world is represented in an unconscious way. And each person has different variety and different predispositions to deal with that kind of process. That's why the fear of the unknown is what this process is about. Is actually, you in your profession, me in my profession, we are maybe 2, 3, or 4 steps ahead of our clients, shining the light in this dark path for them to be able to walk in the safe path.
Yeah.
And that's what we do. We don't have the answers. We don't do miracles. We guide, and we help that process for somebody to feel empowered and in tune again with who they really are, from a broken self to a mended self. And that is really, really important, whether we do it through decluttering, through therapy, through any other care. Helping someone grow can be done in many different ways, and therapy could be just part of that.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I love that you said, we are not miracle workers. And some people do think I come with a Mary Poppins bag and I kind of have a magic wand that I can just go, whoop, and it's all gone.
It's all over.
Yeah. It's
No.
the same with therapy, isn't it? Just because you are a therapist, it's not that you can ask 3 questions and all the problems are solved. The work has to be done, doesn't it?
That's right. And that's why this particular book has been a great challenge, because it's transferring or translating what happens in a therapy room for the layperson, for someone who isn't a psychotherapist, not to use too much jargon, but actually, how do you transmit this kind of process, this kind of transformation that happens on a deeper level? How do you put that on a piece of paper? How can you really convey that in a way where someone can understand this and think, wow, yeah, this isn't just about talking, it's about a million other things that happen, and that it's a cooperation. The therapist and the client have to work together to succeed in this, and it's a difficult task, but the rewards are absolutely incredible.
Yeah. So many parallels. I see the same thing. I am not, if I work with a client, I'm not going to make the decisions. I'm not going to do the work. They need to do the work. And I'm there to help and motivate and support and definitely do some of these things that need to happen.
So maybe what I can add to this, what you just said, is something that the Stoic philosophers tend to say. And they say, it's a principle that I've used actually quite a lot in my personal life and in therapy as well, obviously. And the Stoics say that when an obstacle is in your way, the obstacle becomes the way. And I think that's one of the most profound sayings, really, that I've really come across. When an obstacle is in your way, you take that obstacle, and the obstacle then becomes the way for you to break through. And it's a really interesting way of looking at everyday problems or more deeper problems, where you don't ignore those problems, you don't avoid them, you don't repress them, you actually express them and deal with them in a healthy and channeling way where you can feel empowered again. And that's the key word, empowerment. So the obstacle becomes the way.
Can I then go back, because I had a question about that I think is perfectly connected to this, because in Garrett's chapter, you also talk about grief. And you say grief is an inevitable part of life, and usually grief resolves itself. It may never entirely fade, but it almost always changes and becomes incorporated into daily life, so the grieving person can move on. When it doesn't, it's complicated grief or complex grief. And I see that a lot with people who have clutter. Does that make sense that I see that?
Yes, it makes a lot of sense. And of course, sometimes you have that kind of complex grief. You have it also together with complex trauma or
Mm-hmm.
complex PTSD, for example. So again, in our experience, in our profession, I mean, yours and mine, we do see that kind of grief and trauma to do with loss.
Mm-hmm.
It is such a common threat in a lot of the people we see that they have experienced some kind of loss on a deeper level. And sometimes they've experienced multiple losses, which becomes the complicated grief and the complicated traumas and so forth. And then, of course, this is what we call acted out. These are acting out behaviors in terms of the clutter and the compulsive element to it. So unpicking those layers of trauma, those layers of grief, those layers of, deep-rooted issues, is quite a challenging task. And again, underneath all that clutter, all that hoard is someone who wants to break free, So again, from repression to expression.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. Now, you describe a feeling of overwhelm, and you use the sea as a metaphor. And I would love it if you can describe that, because I thought that was absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, so there's a couple of metaphors with the sea, and I think use it also to do with anxiety. When people are anxious, and I think let's just describe a little bit what anxiety means. On the whole, anxiety means fear of the future. So when you're anxious about something, it's very rarely about the here and now. It's always the what ifs. What if this happens? What if that happens? And that's when your anxiety raises. So if you misinterpret something, you start predicting the future in a negative way, so your anxiety rises. And we use the metaphor of the sea, for example, as a wave rising, and that's your anxiety. Now, most people want to jump off that wave, and they don't want to feel the discomfort that anxiety produces, which is the fight or flight response and so forth. And what we encourage clients is to actually stay on that wave, just stay on the tip of the wave until the wave will naturally come down. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, and of course, then what happens is the anxiety will anticipate. So don't jump off early. So we use different techniques, whether it's mindfulness, whether it's cognitive restructuring. We use different techniques depending on a client's susceptibility in terms of how they can work, their age, and so forth. We use the sea in other metaphors like relaxing, for example. So, one way of using this is when we say to people that, if you're at a shipwreck and you see land, if you try and swim too fast, you're going to sink, basically. And experts say you just have to float. You just have to harmonize. And that's the third principle I use sometimes when we use the fight or flight response. I use the third response, which is called harmonizing. So you can fight, you can run away, or you can harmonize. And harmonizing is very important. You harmonize, you contain yourself within that particular experience, and you let it take you away with it. So the pain becomes less and the discomfort usually dissipates when that happens.
Mm. I love that, because again, it just made me, because you said you need to allow yourself to float instead of riding the waves. You don't want to exhaust yourself.
Correct.
Since you will not get closer to safety. And it reminded me of so many of our listeners, of people in our Facebook group, people who listen to this podcast who go, all guns blazing, I'm going to tackle my clutter this weekend because I've had enough. And they pull everything out. And 2 hours later, they look around and they go in a complete panic because they're like, what have I done? And they have exhausted themselves so much that they're like, I can't do this again. And then it takes longer and longer before they can muster the energy to do something else. And Lesley and I are all about, constantly we say, break it down, make it small, do one thing, one tiny drawer, one item. And this was just such and I thought, this is exactly what people say. I just want to pedal and pedal and pedal back to land. And I thought it completely resonated with me.
The more you wrestle, the more you're going to exhaust yourself, the more you're going to drown. Now, the jargon word that this metaphor came from in therapy is called metastance. Mm-hmm. Now, a metastance, which we also use in supervision, is when you take a step back. Mm-hmm. You don't overreact to an email. You don't overreact to a message. You don't overreact to someone saying something. You don't overreact. You take a meta stance. You try and contain yourself, or what we call emotional regulation. And the jargon word is meta stance. So I take a step back. That's another way of looking at it, where I assess, and I reassess what has happened. And I think that gives you just that kind of break where you can actually don't overreact. And then most of us will make a mistake if we overreact. If we just go all or nothing, and react and overreact to a situation, most likely we're going to be disappointed.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. Listeners, what do you think so far? Are you hearing stuff where you think to yourself, yes, that's me. I am like that. Or wow, what a great insight. I've never thought about it this way. Hi, just a little break from this podcast episode to ask whether you have heard about our membership. Using our tried and tested Reset Your Home system, we will guide you thought by thought, room by room, and day by day through your decluttering journey. It's a game changer. What are you waiting for? We have both monthly and annual options, and all the details you need are at members.declutterhub.com. Now, Stelios, of course, this podcast, we're definitely going to talk a little bit about hoarding because, of course, as we said earlier, we all know you from the television where you were the psychologist on the Hoarder Next Door. And thankfully, you also have one of your chapters in your book about a hoarding disorder. And of course, I'm very interested in that. So I really want to spend the second part of the podcast talking about that because I think it's so important. And the first thing I thought, what you say in your book is a hoarding disorder is a mental health condition characterized by a compulsive need to acquire and keep possessions, even when they're not needed or even repulsive. That is quite... quite a thing to take in, isn't it?
It is quite a thing to take in, and it's quite a thing when you see it. And when, in a way, I think sometimes as therapists, when you actually work with hoarders and you see these kind of insurmountable type of hoard, and some of it quite dangerous, whether it's dead animals or animal hoarding, whatever, you kind of feel the first instance, and you're only human, you feel a kind of sense of helplessness because you want to help this person so much. Mm-hmm. But of course, you have to just work through that, and you have to work through the difficulty. And again, it's probably the only mental health disorder that manifests itself so visually than any other mental health disorder, really. It's the only one that can affect the person who's suffering from their environment, the people around them, their family, their neighbors. You have, elements of infestation to fire to, it goes on and on and on. And it's just such a complex. And I think, yes, what you just read encompasses just a small part of how difficult this disorder is, not just from an emotional point of view, but also from a practical, physical, physiological, and so many other aspects that are complex to deal with, but not impossible.
That's hopeful. That is hopeful.
It is. And it's actually working as a team. So, having professionals like yourself, having other professionals working with us, I think as a therapist, you need to know your limitations. You can't really take the whole project. It's impossible for me to do everything. I will focus on the emotional and the psychological well-being, and then a professional like you will focus on the decluttering, and then maybe we have a psychiatrist who might focus on the medication. So we have to work as a team. If somebody is severely suffering from compulsive hoarding, it isn't a one-man job. I think it is complex, and it will need a more what we call an integrative approach or a multimodal approach to help someone and help them get out of this condition.
Yeah, I believe so. I believe so as well, because it's indeed in your book you say it's especially with compulsive hoarders, they really literally create a mess so visible and loud to others that the disorder is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to disguise or hide. It can stay hidden for a long time until some sort of crisis happens.
That's right, and that's why I also refer to it as visual noise.
Yeah.
And the same. If you have volume noise, you turn it up, you get deafened. With visual noise, you get blind. It's just such a huge amount of stuff that it is visual noise. But it's repressed noise. Again, that word repression. And how can we get rid of that repression and help the person become resilient, stronger, empowered? Because it's years and years of bad habit. It isn't just a compulsive hoarding, but it's all the ripple effects that produces, whether it's sometimes a common characteristic that I've seen is bad nutrition.
Yeah.
And that is really a very common characteristic with a lot of compulsive hoarders. They eat expired food. And in fact, when you read my book, you'll see that the first encounter of hoarding that I came across was over 25 years ago when I trained in eating disorders. When I had my clinical placement at the time, I trained in an eating disorder unit, and the compulsive hoarding of food was quite common as a characteristic and symptom of anorexia or bulimia and so forth. So, but of course, at that time, because it wasn't a classified mental health condition, it was part of an OCD classification. But looking back, that was my first initial experience working with compulsive hoarders who have an underlying psychological condition, but also compulsively hoarding food, for example.
Yeah, because in the past, hoarding was usually associated with OCD, wasn't it? But then actually back in 2013, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, this is a bit of a mouthful, listeners. We call it the DSM, the 5th edition, DSM number 5, now makes a distinction between forms of hoarding associated with the obsessions and compulsive OCD and a separate hoarding disorder. Why was that so important that was a difference? Because there is so much overlap.
It is very important because it can be a distinct mental health condition. You don't have to have the obsessive compulsive element. And categorizing everything in one bundle and stereotyping someone who's a hoarder as OCD was not really appropriate. So through research and through some fantastic researchers like Professor Kiosses and other people who've done some great work in bringing that to the forefront and abroad as well, obviously, it was important to segregate that and have a clear diagnosis, because otherwise you'll be treating the untreatable. If you treat someone who's got hoarding but not OCD and you treat them for OCD, then you're not doing the right treatment. So it is important to classify that and really distinguish that. But I think it's ongoing anyway. So there's still a lot to learn about the neurological aspects of hoarding. There's a lot of intricacies and a lot of still ongoing research for us to understand better why we have this kind of disorder and the ways of perhaps controlling this disorder with different ways, whether it's therapy, medication, and so forth. So it's still ongoing. We're not there yet. There's still lots of research being undertaken at the moment.
Yeah, because I know this because I've been in houses that have a hoard. I've met people who have compulsive hoarding, and it's a very serious illness, isn't it? It's sometimes it's a bit described as, like you say in your book, it's just the cat lady with loads of cats. She's got lots of stuff, but it's this very serious illness that people struggle with, and it's very, very complex, isn't it?
It is extremely complex, and what most people don't realize is that the onset of compulsive hoarding starts in early teens or late teens. I've had, after my program, quite a few referrals with younger hoarders, 12, 13, 14 years old, having suffered loss, death, or having experienced something traumatic. They started hoarding. And of course, what happens with parents is they don't see that as hoarding because they can't connect that. But I think quite a few of them who've seen my program afterwards realize that what their young child is exhibiting is actually a compulsive hoarding. They collect things. They come back from school, for example, and they will pass a rubbish bin or they will pass a skip and they will bring things back every day. And suddenly the room is full of stuff that they've collected from outside. And I think that's really important to know. It isn't the stereotypical Mr. Trebus or the old person with a trolley running around with thousands of bags. It is actually the early onset is in our teens. So it's really important to be aware of that.
Yeah, for sure. Because what in the past happened a lot is people thought, we're going to help a person who's got a hoard in their house. We're going to empty the hoard, throw everything in the skip, and then they're cured.
No.
But nobody helped the reason why they were hoarding and what the whole background is, what the trauma was. So of course the house got re-hoarded again.
Exactly. And you see that in one of the old episodes of Life of Grime with Mr. Trebus, really, who put at the forefront these kind of shows, especially in this country, on hoarding. And I think there's a point where the council just empties his house, and then within a year or two, he continues, the hoarding process. And I think what's important to bear in mind at this juncture is that when you actually declutter the house, or you get rid of all the stuff that our hoarders accumulated without their consent or collaboration, the research suggests that they will experience the loss of their items in the same way that they would have experienced loss or the death of a loved one.
Wow.
And that's how emotionally attached they are to their clutter. And it's a word that we use, which is called anthropomorphizing, which is basically the items become almost a human-like element in terms of attaching emotions. So that's how powerful the emotional intensity and attachment is to those items. So if you get rid of an item or items, and the client is not aware of that, and you've not collaborated, their grief, and I'm talking about grief again, and their loss for that particular item or items is so intense and severe that they're being re-traumatized. So it's very important when we work with hoarders that we are very gentle, very empathic, and we collaborate with them. We don't do things just because. And of course, I understand, for a lot of families who are frustrated and partners, the first and quickest solution is, I'm going to get rid of all the stuff, and I'm going to clear the home. That doesn't resolve the underlying problems or symptoms or conditions, and it certainly doesn't resolve the mental health aspect. In fact, it exacerbates, and it actually re-victimizes and re-traumatizes the hoarding client.
Wow. So very important. So if you're listening to this and you know somebody, or you've got somebody, family member, emptying a house overnight with a skip and a lot of people involved, and not doing anything about the reasons why, and that the person is in control, is actually making things worse, isn't it?
It does, yes. And I think there's some fantastic resources out there. Probably one of the best one is Helpful Hoarders by Jasmine Harmon, who, it's an incredible resource there. And people, I think it should be the first port of call for compulsive hoarding. It's amassed a huge amount of information and guidance that people can, and family members can tap into. And I think that's really important, to actually do some research first before you help someone who's close to you, who suffers from compulsive hoarding.
Yeah. You describe compulsive hoarding as a way to communicate feelings such as abandonment, loss, rage, fear, grief, and shame. And people who are compulsive hoarders often speak of an emptiness or void inside.
That's right. That's an interesting, and I tried to put that in very simple terms. It is a very complicated subject because it comes back to these kind of suppressing my emotions. However much we suppress our emotions and some of our anxieties, they want to come out, and they're going to come out in some way or another. So they're going to come out through compulsively drinking, taking drugs, promiscuity, hoarding, whatever it is, however we act out our unconscious suppressed emotions. And sometimes, or in most cases, the compulsive hoarding aspect has that element where you can see the visible aggression and the visible anxiety and the pain and the grief that is exhibited on these types of hoards. You kind of, for me anyway, I can get the feeling what may be underneath a pile, what lies underneath those piles, metaphorically, what traumas and what losses and you can see that in some of my episodes on the Hoarder Next Door. And again, talking about the Hoarder Next Door, People don't, the viewers who've seen the program don't really realize the huge amount of work that goes behind the scenes. Like in my first series, I filmed almost 800 hours for a 4-hour series, and the support that is given, and I have to say the production company at the time, 2020 and Channel 4, were extremely ethical, extremely supportive, really just amazing to work with them. At the time was really great, and I think there was a lot of support given to anybody who was part of the show. But you don't see the amount of work, and a lot of people said to me, well, we don't see how you got from A to B, and of course what is impossible to cram in those 3 or 4, 6 weeks of treatment is the intensity of the treatments, from EMDR to mindfulness to CBT that these individuals received. Of course, it's hours and hours of work to get to some stage of emotional regulation. Doesn't always work, it's not, again, like we said before, initially in our show, we're not miracle workers. We facilitate, and we try our best to help someone move forwards and encourage them to fly.
Yeah. And that is true, isn't it? That's the TV programs, they only have blocks of 5 minutes and they have to cram a lot in an hour. I know how much goes on in the background, but the viewers just think, okay, bish, bash, bosh, that hour television, and skip there, just throw everything away, team of people, they go to Stelios once or twice, and all is well in the world. But it is television, and we have to keep that in mind. They can only do the couple of highlights over a period of time, can't they?
That's right. And I understand that. And, I understand it has to be some form of entertainment, but at the same time, it has to be also realistic. And I think as the show progressed, they were more able to show that kind of realistic aspect of therapy and difficulty and resistance. Like I say in my book, resistance always goes the opposite direction, like friction. And you have to show that kind of resistance that happens in almost every session with clients, whether it's compulsive hoarding, OCD, panic attacks, and so forth. There's always some kind of resistance, and you work with that resistance. You go along with that.
Yeah. Now, interesting, you said there's actually a difference between clutter and hoarding. And hoarding is an accumulation of large number of items, often of little value, while clutter is a messy environment, but the home is safe to walk around in.
Yeah, that's really true. And I think sometimes I find that, for some of us who work in this profession and see, individuals who suffer from clutter or hoarding and so forth, actually, sometimes they don't know the etymology of the word. So, so if you ask someone, well, what does clutter mean? What does the actual word mean? What does it come from? Why do we name a pile of stuff that's disorganized as clutter? And I think sometimes it's important to know the root of the words that we use, because it gives a little bit more insight about what it is we're dealing with, like naming a particular disorder or naming a particular problem. Giving it a name and understanding that name can give us a better understanding of what we're dealing with. So clutter is actually a word that's been used from the 14th century, believe it or not. And I think initially it was called, I'm just trying to remember, I think it was called Clutter or something like that. And I think it was used originally to describe a blockage or a clot formed by heaping things on top of each other. And then I think in the 15th century, it was turned into clutter. So it is a clear distinction: clutter, hoarding, and collecting. Now, most of us, including me, my house does get cluttered, but it doesn't mean I have a compulsive hoarding problem. The hoarding problem is a lot more complicated. There's that kind of emotional attachment. Again, people confuse sometimes collectors with hoarders and people got clutter. Again, there's a clear distinction between hoarding, clutter, and collecting. Now, if you're a collector, let's say, I don't know, you collect ornaments, or you collect old computers, or you collect watches, or whatever you collect, there isn't that sense of embarrassment. Okay, almost all compulsive hoarders are embarrassed. They carry a huge amount of shame, which doesn't necessarily mean you will carry if your house is cluttered. Sometimes you don't care. I've been to some of my colleagues' houses who are professors, and it's cluttered with books, millions of books, but they're not embarrassed about that. They're not ashamed. But almost every individual who suffers from a compulsive hoarding disorder is embarrassed, is traumatized by the shame and the humiliation and embarrassment the hoard causes. So that's a clear distinction. Somebody who collects doesn't have that. They will exchange things with another collector. They'll invite you over to have a look at their collection. They will clear the dust off their collection and so forth. So they might have millions of things, but there's a kind of organization as part of that. The same with clutter. Sometimes you can have a cluttered desk, but it could be organized in your head. But you don't have that emotional, pathological attachment that compulsive hoarders have. So that's why it's important to make that clear distinction. However, sometimes with our busy lives, we can have cluttered homes that it's gone too far. We need someone, like yourself, for example, to come and help us because we can't really, I've accumulated too many clothes and so forth. So I'm not sure. Have you seen that? Have you seen that kind of less shame with people who've got clutter than people who've got hoarding? Have you seen that?
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Definitely. And sometimes people who have clutter call themselves a hoarder while it's not. So the other way around as well. So they call me and say, I've got stuff. I'm such a hoarder and I've got and I'm like, okay, let me just come and have a look. And and then it's like, no, you've just got a bit of clutter and things for a reason have gotten out of control because something recently changes or you start
busy lifestyle, busy life,
3 kids in the space of 4 years and all of those things. So it's very interesting. And people who collect items are definitely not always cluttered or hoarders. So they are different things, but sometimes one can morph into the other.
Yes, they can. And sometimes the research suggests there's what we call a genetic predisposition. So if you're a collector and there's a history in the family of hoarding, sometimes adverse life events like the death of someone close to you or losing your job, you can transfer from a collector to a compulsive hoarder if you've got that kind of genetic predisposition. So there's a higher probability that you will end up being a hoarder through an adverse life event if there's a history of compulsive hoarding in your family.
Interesting. I thought that could possibly be the case because I think when you see very full houses, there's normally then when you hear the story, you can hear that in their family there is several generations who have that as well.
That's right. There's a strong genetic predisposition. There's no doubt about that. But it's not always the main factor, but there is a strong predisposition, a genetic predisposition, definitely. And we see that. However, it doesn't mean that because you are from a family of compulsive hoarders, you are going to become a compulsive hoarder.
Exactly.
But there is a predisposition. But you could be the other way around. You could become, the opposite. And then I think sometimes what we and I might write that if I do another volume, I might write about children of hoarders. And I think that's something really neglected. And through my program, I've seen more children of hoarders than actually hoarders themselves. And we mustn't forget the insurmountable stress, grief, anger, shame that family members feel and experience, and sometimes as children being brought up with a parent or parents who are compulsive hoarders. It's a really traumatizing experience for someone who's lived for 15, 20 years in a house where they had to lie, no sleepovers, no visits. They live a lie about finding excuses to have someone at their home and so forth. So these young children who are now adults have lived a childhood that is not normal to most young children. So we have to bear that in mind, that it's also, the family members and children of hoarders that actually also need help.
Yeah. If you write that book, please come back, Stelios, because
I will.
I would love to talk to you about that. I would like to finish this podcast with my favorite quote of your book. I mean, there were many. I normally never write notes in books because I'm like, book is kind of like, yeah, you read it, but there was so much. I've got notes, I've got sticky notes, I've got pencil writing, I've got highlighters, I've got so much good stuff. But my favorite quote was, and it's actually in your final thoughts: if you feel shame, let it go. If you feel fear, let it go. Eventually, you become wise enough to realize that you do not want that toxic stuff inside of you.
Yeah,
It gave me goosebumps. Honestly, I was like, this is exactly.
Yeah,
You're talking about the
exactly.
emotions, but I talk about the stuff.
The
And I
stuff.
thought, this is the same with
It is.
houses of stuff, a little stuff or a lot of stuff. You don't want that toxic stuff inside of your house, and let it go. Let go of that
Let it
shame, that
go.
fear. You are enough. You are enough yourself. You don't need that
Exactly.
much. And
Exactly.
a lot of stuff brings so much toxicity into a house, and you free up your mind and your space and your heart, and it brings a calmness. And
Yeah,
that quote just gave me goosebumps.
exactly. And I think, believe it or not, that quote took me ages to write because I had to work with my publisher, like, how do we summarize, in a couple of lines, what all this book is about. It is about letting go of toxic items, toxic people, toxic feelings, toxic events, toxic, whatever that may be, that poisons our innermost self
Yeah.
and poisons the people around us. And of course, it's poison that slowly kills you.
Yeah.
And letting go is the power of talking.
Yeah.
And the power of talking is the power of listening. And the power of listening is changing,
Yeah.
so you have to listen to yourself when you talk, consciously or unconsciously, and then you have to let go in creating that change. And it is a powerful metaphor. And I think you're right. It is a powerful way of creating change, both within ourselves and with others around us.
Yeah.
Let's take a deep breath.
Thank you
You're welcome.
so much, Stelios, for being on this podcast, for sharing your thoughts, for writing such an amazing book. I will put all the show notes. We'll put a link to your book in the show notes. We'll put links to your social media so people can follow
Thank you.
you. And we'll also put in the help for hoarders that you mentioned from Jasmine. We'll put that as well in the
Oh,
show
please.
notes.
Yes, it's amazing.
Yeah, so have a look at declutterhub.com/160 so you can easily find those show notes and details. Stelios, thank you for being here.
Thank you. It was a great honor, and I'm really humbled by your program. It's amazing. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. So listeners, are you inspired, or have we given you something to think about after listening to this podcast? I can really recommend you having a look at the book. There were so many light bulb moments for me. And I've been in the decluttering and organizing world, just like Lesley, for 12 years, but so many things I thought, oh, that's so good. That's so good. And the stories are amazing. So definitely check it out. If you've enjoyed this podcast, or if you think to yourself, this is a podcast that my friend needs to hear or my family member needs to hear, please share it. You can find the sharing buttons in the show notes details, and then you can share it with others. Please join us in our Facebook group, the Declutter Hub community, because we have such a wonderful, supportive community of people who struggle with clutter as well. So come and hang out with us. And if you don't want to miss the next episode, please subscribe to the Declutter Hub podcast, and it will come into your notifications each Friday. So thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.